Yup, it's recording.
Perfect.
Okay, then I'll start. Okay, so the story that I chose for the IOC is The Yellow Wallpaper, and it is a story published in 1892 by Charlotte Gilman. And The Yellow Wallpaper depicts a marriage in late 19th century America and reveals how a woman struggled to cope with the inequality between genders during this time. And it is also a story about how a young wife suffering from depression, potentially postpartum depression, how she expresses her intimate thoughts from the beginning of her confinement until she finally falls into complete madness at the end. So there are three themes that stand out in the yellow wallpaper. First is the theme of subjugation of woman, portrayed by how the wife feels limited and undermined in not just her movement but also expression. Second is the clash between reason and emotion, which is revealed through the interaction between the wife, who portrays the emotion part, and how the husband portrays the reason part. But today I'm going to investigate further how the novel's specific point of view reveals the wife's reaction to her own subjugation, especially the way she's confined and limited in not only her movement but also her expression of thoughts. So the entire story is written from a limited first person point of view and a unreliable narrative point of view as well, which means that the narrator herself tells the story in her very own voice, but it has limited access to the thoughts of characters around her, like John, her wife, the wife's husband, and Jenny. This perspective only allows the readers to kind of interpret the story on based on what the narrator thinks, which sometimes result in a very limited point of view and limited understanding of reality, as we can see in the yellow wallpaper. So basically, the perspective makes readers feel more engaged because they have to keep in mind that the narration or the story is not like reliable, and they have to figure things out as they go. And so the thesis statement would be like, so my analysis kind of aims to convey how the narrative's deeply unreliable and limited first person point of view reveals the way about how a woman acts or reacts to female subjugation that takes the form of condescension in the language used by the husband and his control over the wife's movement. So my first supporting argument, as I wrote in my essay structure, is that the narrative's intimate and very honest first person perspective, or with the first person perspective, the readers become aware of the language that is used by both the narrator and her husband, which reveals such subjugation. And what their language reveals is that it kind of sheds light on how the marriage is based on very rigid gender norms that result in female subjugation. So, for example, when at the very beginning of the book, when the narrator expresses concern over how the mansion feels like a haunted house, the husband laughs at her, and he also calls his wife a little girl, which to me was an indication that John sees himself as a mature adult, and his wife is just a child who doesn't have the same capabilities, the same intellectual capabilities to think and act on herself. And John's laugh, also in this situation, exposes the very deep condescension that the husband has for the wife's feeling, but it also reveals the very troubling reality of an entire gender being very dismissed in a way for being too emotional and anxious, which is what the laugh here represents. And the laugh here, the reason why it represents that way is because it's very casual, and this casual disregard doesn't immediately register as problematic because the wife's reaction afterwards says that this is what one expects in marriage. So this shows how the narrator is comforting herself with the thought that this type of condescension is perfectly acceptable. And for readers, this would reveal an unreliable narrator who's very struggling to tell herself that everything is normal, when in fact, late at the very end of the novel, it's kind of clear that she's being oppressed. So, and this also reveals this very subjugation and how women's didn't, and how natural women felt about it. So that's very problematic as well. And the second argument that I brought for the IOC is that the narrator's very deeply unreliable perspective reveals how the narrator and her husband feels about her confinement, but it also adds emphasis to the fact of the very subtle but very unnerving ways that patriarchy controls women. And I thought that this was best revealed in the part
What
where
was that last word? What was that last word? Something of women?
how patriarchy controls women.
Okay.
And I thought that this was best revealed in the section where the narrator describes the husband as very careful and loving, while also adding that he doesn't even let her stir without special direction. And readers also become aware that the wife has a scheduled prescription for each hour in the day, and that she'd feel basically ungrateful not to value it more. And on the surface level, when I read it like once, I thought that this quote was an indication of how deeply the husband really cares for the wife. But when I read this story like 3 or 4 times and more, I came to realize that this quote is that the readers and I just noticed the degree of control that the husband has through the special direction and the scheduled prescription for each hour. And I thought that as time passed, this felt more like a prison rather than a home, because her wife was restricted in every single hour of the day, and that's what I felt like so surprised about. And just like the way the narrator comforted herself when she was patronized in my first supporting argument, she tries to convince herself that this prison-like reality is just another sign of how her husband is caring and loving. And to go even further, she directs criticism toward herself, meaning that, and we can know this because she says she calls herself basically ungrateful when she doesn't appreciate it more. And the readers will notice that the narrator, she tries to justify and make sense of her own confinement. So I think this was another way in which how patriarchy has complete control over the woman's movement and thoughts, as I said in my thesis statement. And I thought that this complete control was, and that the degree of this complete control was so much to the point that women lose the ability to objectively assess the situation and rather just accept everything that their husband tells the woman. And a potential counter argument to what I said is that the unreliability and the limited first person narrator doesn't does not show female subjugation very directly, and it can also, and another counter argument is that this can also prove that a women are untrustworthy, weak, and without the support of men, the woman won't be able to survive. And what this counter argument would then imply is that this confusing narrative just proves how women are very unstable and need to control and care of men. So this is one of the counter argument that I kind of that I was I identified. And to go on to the rebuttals, I felt that it was more important to recognize how this unreliable and very personal narrative captures the very internal struggles that I kept repeating in this IOC about how the woman tries to make sense of her confinement and how she tries to justify the confinement. And it also shows how deep and how pervasive, but very natural the impact of patriarchy can be, because the narrative's perspective is very effective in revealing how the unspoken thoughts and emotions of women are impacted by what the husband and what the male individuals say. So a basic conclusion, which I just kind of identified, was that women's suffrage still tends to be an issue, and while the discrimination is not that direct, not that pervasive, I felt that there was still some reasons, some points in which women were discriminated in today's society. For example, in like jobs or as a athlete, women have even in marriage as well. Women are the one who carries the baby, and they tend to get on leaves more. So I felt that in society that women were paid less sometimes in jobs, and how athletes they had to the women and men couldn't receive the same treatment, as we can see the tension that NBA and WNBA have. So I felt that those are some points in which the discrimination and the difference between men and women kind of lies in today's society.
Pause. Okay. So, how'd you feel?
I was very nervous, and it was kind of hard to just go from the outline to the script. So I think I should.
Yeah.
So I think I should like practice more.
Yeah. Well, one thing I noticed, Isaac, just about that point was that I felt like you were really seemed comfortable at the beginning with just kind of speaking and sharing, kind of going through that initial part without really like relying on your notes. But like as it went on, I think it got hard to kind of just it became more kind of relied on notes. So let me give you some feedback. All right, and I think you did a great job. I think it was excellent, formative and rehearsal. I think some of the strengths that really stood out to me were your language, from your use of, objectively assessing the situation, justifying confinement, this sort of rigid gender norms and subjugation. You're talking about patriarchy and point of view and perspective. I thought that was all really strong use of language to describe your understanding of the story. And I think that you showed some deep knowledge. Your examples from the story showed some deep knowledge and perception about the story. So I thought those were all really positives from your piece. As far as areas for growth, first off, think about the time.
Yeah.
So that clocked in at 9 minutes.
Oh.
Okay. So that clocked in pretty much twice as long as it needs to be, because I really didn't. I mean, at that point right now, I wouldn't have any, like, first of all, like, I'd probably stop you at 5.5 minutes.
Yeah.
So I think that's good that you have 9 minutes for your formative, because now you can kind of understand what you're gonna cut, right,
Okay.
and what you need to do and how you can refocus. And I can give you some ideas for that. But so obviously making this more concise.
Yep.
Okay. And then my other big point is, I wonder how your thesis can become more clear in terms of the way the point of view and perspective. I think you do an amazing job talking about the way in which the narrator of the story is subjugated, both physically, emotionally, the way that the gender norms subjugate her and all women at this time, the way that this idea of this confinement and the inability for them to, for her to objectively assess her situation. So I think you do an excellent job describing the ways in which this story shows that subjugation, physical and emotional. So, like, I like the way you described it, but so for example, in your thesis, I think you talked about, like, the subjugation of, like, her. Like, I think just if you're going to say, the point of view and perspective in the story shows the physical and emotional subjugation of the narrator. So, my question then is, how does, and I think you started to kind of hint at this, but I think you need to make it more explicit. How does the point of view and the perspective reveal that subjugation?
Oh, so like specific, like, examples.
In ways that we wouldn't normally, it wouldn't have necessarily been revealed in other ways. So you don't want to say, like, if this had been in third person, like you can in the counter argument, but you don't want to say, like, if this had been in third person, this, but, like, I think what you want to say is something like, I think the other thing that you might want to mention is the way that, this is first person.
Yeah.
It has an unreliable narrator. And first person is limited. All first person is limited because you only know what's happening inside of.
Yeah.
You only know the perspective of the narrator.
Oh, so
Okay.
Mr. Jacobs?
Yeah.
For my thesis, then, can I say something like how the narrator's internal thoughts are very aligned to what the husband tells her? So what the husband kind of restricts her is very deeply, like, embedded into the female's mind, such that what they're thinking internally also complies to what the male's perspective is. Can I word it like that?